several top secret, highly secure locations throughout South Texas. This is the return of the Spurs Insider podcast with Jeff McDonald and Tom Orsborn and Nick Talbot. This is Mike Finger. We are coming together to talk about the Spurs the morning after a big NBA draft in which the Spurs were rumored to be doing all kinds of things and then wound up making the pick that they were scheduled to make. We'll go around the virtual room here, starting with Jeff. Did that surprise you? What are your takes? Your hot takes?
Does that surprise me? I guess in retrospect, probably not, because the odds of in any given instance with any team, maybe the odds of a trade happening are less than a trade not happening. Like, you take the field if you're making that bet. So, we know that they look to move up. They look to move, but no deal was in the offing, and where they were at number 11. I don't know how they felt about it, but I felt like there were a lot of good options there at number 11. So I think it was wise to stay put and make a pick and take a guy that you think can help you, maybe immediately, but certainly in the years to come.
You talk about good options. An argument could be made that the options they had there were just as good as options that teams at 4, 5, 6 had in a draft where there wasn't any stars that seemed to be the consensus choice for the top talent in the draft. It seemed like the kind of draft where it made sense not to kind of mortgage too much to move up in a draft when your evaluation – the kid they took at number 11, Devin Vassell, I saw rated in some places as the 6th best player in the draft going into it. They could have taken Tyrese Halliburton, who was rated by some places as the 4th best player in the draft. It just seemed like a kind of a win-win situation for them to stay where they were. Tom, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really liked it. I thought they got a perfect fit for them in Devin. He's a 3-and-D player. That's what they wanted. He fits in. He's a good outside shooter, perimeter defender. I thought it was a great fit for them. And as Brian said over and over, character-wise, which counts so much to these guys. Him and Trey Jones are off the charts. I like what they did. I thought they did a really good job.
I was shocked at that general manager for that other team that said they got a low character guy who was just like 5th on their board.
Yeah. I'm waiting for the first GM to come out on draft night and say, "Man, that guy we took was a real butthole."
Nick, any general thoughts?
I know. I thought they took the player that everyone thought they were going to take. Of course, a couple people thought they might take the kid from Villanova but with how the draft fell, I think they took the guy they wanted, that 3-and-D player. He kind of, could end up being a facsimile of Danny Green. That's always, a good thing, especially for San Antonio fans, for what they would want here. The only surprise in where it would have been, it's like you said, they could have taken Halliburton after he fell. Because I think a lot of people had Halliburton as a higher player, but he wasn't exactly the best fit for them because they already have a glut of point guards, and he's kind of, a point guard. I can play off the ball maybe, but most people see him as a point guard. And I think that's the only other possible they had right there. If you're looking at talent-wise and how people had rated the guys in the draft, if they didn't want to reach, I think they took the right guy. And, that's kind of what you would expect from the Spurs. They didn't reach like some of the other teams. I thought, obviously right in front of you, the Suns probably made the reach of the draft, taking the kid from Maryland. So that kind of helped him out a lot too, because a lot of people thought the Suns should have taken Vassell. So they helped him out by taking Jalen Smith instead. So it kind of just fell the Spurs' way to take, as you said, a guy that some had rated the 6th most talented guy in the draft.
We're going with Vassell is a facsimile of Danny Green. Why don't we just swing for the fences? Let's call him a facsimile of Kawhi Leonard. Can we do that?
That would be too much. I'm trying to be nice.
Okay.
He's a 3-and-D player.
I haven't had a lot of sleep, so I'm going nuts over here maybe.
I think realistic. If you look at his ceiling, I think Danny Green's probably it. I don't think you're. I like you said before the draft. We're not looking at Tim Duncan top player here. I mean,
the ceiling is not Danny Green. Come on, man. I mean,
that finger riled up over here.
They'd be pleased with that, but let's not misuse the term ceiling and say that's the best he could be. I think that the ceiling for that guy is. I mean, the term ceiling means the highest he can possibly climb to, and I think that with his talent and his build and just the stuff that we've seen on his highlight tapes, I think that the ceiling is a little bit higher than that. Would they be happy with Danny Green? Sure, but I think there's potential for even more than that. One thing about the Halliburton situation, Brian Wright on his Zoom last night with us, without coming out and saying it directly, when someone was asking about the choice between drafting the best player and drafting for need, he said, obviously you always go after the best player, but he kind of acknowledged that in cases when you have guys evaluated in the same range, that there can be a tiebreaker. And I think that probably was the case between Devin and Halliburton there, and that if these guys kind of have similar ceilings, similar floors, similar all that type of stuff, you have to go with the wing, the 3-and-D guy. Like Tom said, that's been missing from the Spurs last year, the last couple of years. This kid just seems to fit the roster a little bit better, and I think, like I mentioned earlier, that's probably the tiebreaker in this case.
I bet the Spurs, like a lot of us, were probably surprised Halliburton was even on the board at that point. I think most everything we saw was him going top 10. So
they had talked to him before the draft, right, Jeff?
Yes, that is correct.
And probably assuming that he would be an option for them if they traded up. Because they had, according to lots of people, they were working to trade up, whether it was to the Hawks pick at number 6 or even as high as the Warriors at number 2. I mean, they went through a lot of permutations, and Brian Wright kind of acknowledged that last night, that they went through all kinds of ideas and were erasing and rewriting over their dry erase board. And I don't think that there's probably some sentiment out there that the Spurs kind of stood pat. I don't think it was because of a lack of effort or trying. I think they explored lots of things and probably will over the next days and weeks, right?
Yeah, I mean, but who knows how that all shakes out. I mean, you want to talk about specific players, or what are we doing right now?
It's what I mean.
Open-ended.
I think in general,
we're going to talk about the second rounder. We're going to skip over Trey Jones, like he doesn't matter. Who's running this? Daniel Ashcraft.
You want to?
Trey Jones was a pretty good pick for the second round, I think.
Let's go through the history of how many second rounders stick. I mean, sure, Trey Jones, great. He's a point guard, on ball defender. Played at Duke, was ACC Player of the Year. Historically, not just with the Spurs, but just in general, not a lot of second rounders stick. And if they get anything at all out of him, I think that's a big win.
Yeah,
I mean, they got each of their past 2 second rounders on the roster right now,
and
they're not in the playoffs. So yeah,
right.
And they're not in the playoffs. I think the Spurs tend to do a little bit more than some teams do with their second round picks, just because they have a better developmental. And the reason I like the Trey Jones pick is you get an ACC Player of the Year type guy, and then you can stick him in Austin for a year if they're even going to play. We'll see what. And
the most excited they've been about an All ACC performer from Duke since they drafted the legendary, was it Chris Carrawell?
Chris Carrawell.
Yes, they were excited about that pick too. That was a big second rounder that had an All ACC pedigree. I'm just saying, I think that so far in this podcast, we might be underrating the first round pick a little bit and overrating the second round pick, but I could be wrong.
All right, move on then.
Second round pick won't be running this thing. You never know.
The lead up to this draft, we saw a lot of reports about what the Spurs were trying to do, and generally the Spurs aren't the type of team where stuff like that leaks out, where anyone even anticipates that the Spurs are making moves. There seemed to be a feeling around the league that they were at least trying to shake things up. And my point on that is that, of course they were, because their roster, as we mentioned over and over on this podcast last year, was imperfect and flawed. And not everybody fits into a roster that could become a contender someday. So, of course, you have two veteran guys in LaMarcus Aldridge and DeMar DeRozan, who they both like a lot. They've always liked a lot. They're good teammates. They're all-star level performers, or have been. But, of course, going into their last year, you're gonna test what the market is and see what you can do with them. And I think we have to draw a line between these guys on the trading block and they're trying to get rid of them, as opposed to just finding out what's out there.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of still spinning our wheels on this topic on this podcast, like maybe for the last year.
Right.
We've been doing this where, yeah, of course you have to be open to moving them. Of course you do, especially at this stage where, and maybe even a little more at this stage where you're not a playoff team, or at least that you will be pleasantly surprised if you're a playoff team this year. Is that fair? Is that fair for me to say?
Well, there's 10 spots now.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
We could talk about that. The NBA just revamped the playoff format where, there's still 8, I guess, official playoff spots, but 10. You
just got to get to the top 10 to have a shot. Okay. Yeah. So that makes that does throw a little wrinkle in there. But I mean, you're not playing for championships anymore here at this stage. You at some point you are just rebuilding for the future, and if you can get any kind of assets that help you in that endeavor, then of course you're open to moving either DeMar DeRozan or LaMarcus Aldridge or both. You also have until the trade deadline to do that, I would also mention. So.
Yeah, as the season progresses, someone's going to want DeMar, I'm sure, as a last piece kind of fit. So I would expect there to be a lot of conversations about him.
And the other thing that we saw in the Orlando bubble, though, is that the Spurs can play with DeMar this way. And so I don't think he necessarily inhibits your growth and development and building for the future if he's still on the roster for a while. LaMarcus, that will be an interesting thing to see when he comes back, because he didn't play in that Orlando bubble. They went on without him and looked pretty good and looked like a team that was playing, in the 21st century. So it'll be interesting to see when he comes back if he inhibits anything and if you have to make decisions along those lines.
Well, that was kind of what I was getting at in terms of, you said this is all about flipping these guys for the future and rebuilding, but I think it's still kind of a this year issue in terms of what you just said, how they played in the bubble. If you want to start DeJounte Murray, Lonnie Walker, and Derek White together in the backcourt, that leaves 2 spots for your center and either DeMar DeRozan or LaMarcus Aldridge. And I realize it sounds silly to kind of say the Spurs have too many players when they didn't even make the playoffs, but
they're loaded.
Yeah. But I mean, if they want to build upon what they did in the bubble with that small ball lineup, it doesn't seem like that's possible if both DeMar and LaMarcus are still around. And sure, like Pop would find a way to make that work next year if they're both around. I mean, they're still.
There's no way for LaMarcus to be your small ball
most
center.
Accomplished players.
Like I agree. Pirtle is, assuming they re-sign Pirtle, is better suited to be that sort of small ball, dirty work center. But there's no way that LaMarcus can fit in that group.
I think it's the vibe of that group just totally changes with him out there. I'm not saying better or worse, but that they don't play the same way with LaMarcus as that small ball guy as with Pirtle. Now might be a good time for you to kind of run down the housekeeping stuff of what exactly, when free agency starts on Friday, 2 days after the draft, what are the roster type issues that face the Spurs immediately.
I mean, I think the big one we just mentioned is going to be Jakob Poeltl and restricted free agency. I mean, I think that's of all the guys that are going to be free agents, I think he's the guy that will be the highest priority to retain for sure. And, he's restricted, so the Spurs will have the right to match any outside offers, yada, yada. So a lot will depend on the market set for him. I'm kind of curious, and this is just off the top of my head. I would have to go back and really think what I really believe on this. But I wonder if, looking back, if the Spurs don't wish they had extended Jakob Poeltl last summer when they could have.
Yep.
Or last fall when they could have.
Yep. That was an option at the time. Some were kind of surprised they didn't, but I mean, I guess it was understanding. You wanted to see for sure. And
but at the same time, at literally the exact same time, they extended DeJounte Murray, who hadn't played in a year and a half, or whatever.
Right.
So, and I have to look at the books to really think about if that makes sense or not. But anyway,
it might still all work out. I mean,
here's my question: how much do you think they're going to pay Marco Bellinelli to bring him back?
Well, I mean, that's just for podcast material.
Is it max or super max for Marco Bellinelli?
I think, along with Tom's Salmon Cup and your Polar Pop, I mean, those are the three stars of this podcast: Marco Bellinelli, the Salmon Cup, and the Polar. Tom, you do have the Salmon Cup working today in your secure location?
I do. It's become a cherished part of my life.
That's good.
Boring life so far.
It brings a lot of joy to me each morning.
Oh my gosh! Do we need to come check on you? Are you okay?
That's debatable.
Doing all right.
That's debatable.
How's life?
That's debatable.
What are you looking? What are you looking to follow over the next week or so, Tom? What do you think faces this team? What is this a crossroads type of situation for them, or is it kind of, you think it's going to end up being status quo?
I just wonder if we're all, maybe shouldn't say all, but overrating what took place in the bubble. Without the travel, without the home court, without playing on the road, without guys. It was a new lineup. It threw everyone for a curve. I just wonder if we're overrating it, and thinking this young core is all that. I'm not downplaying them, but I just wonder.
You're kind of downplaying them.
Well, I guess so. I guess I am.
It's a fair point in that it was also 9 games.
Right. Yeah. Small sample size, and talking eager to. Some people are so eager to move DeMar and Aldridge, and maybe they should to get what they can from them. But what are you going to be left with again?
That's perfectly fair.
I know basketball has become weirdly a short man's game, but I don't know how. Can you go a whole season with Jakob Poeltl as your big man and his backup is Drew Eubanks? You
got Trey Lyles. You got
Trey. Oh well, yeah. Well, Trey wasn't there in the bubble, but yeah, right. He would. I'm assuming we'll be back. They'll pick up his.
I found it interesting that when and this is also much ado about nothing, but I mean it's the off season, so everything is going to be much ado about nothing. The Fiesta colors are back.
Why was it this whole podcast about the Fiesta colors? We have to start over.
The Fiesta colors are back, and in the promo shots, one of the young players who was, I guess, just available to pose in the Fiesta colors was Trey Lyles, and they clearly think something of him, and people forget about him, but he's younger than people think, and I think that they kind of see him as a guy who's going to be around a while.
Or at least you can pick up his option for. I don't have the number in front of me, but it's a very cheap option. Right. You pick that up and you keep him for another year at least. So yeah.
To Tom's very valid point about the bubble, I'll say this: yes, absolutely. Everything that happened in the bubble, not just about the Spurs, but about a lot of teams. Devin Booker, go on down the line.
I'm pretty sure the Suns are going to lose a game.
Right.
At some point.
It probably got overrated to an extent. But when you say Tom asked a question, and I think a legitimate one. Are we sure that this next core is better than a team built around LaMarcus and DeMar? No, we're not sure about that. But I think the response to that would be we know with a pretty high degree of certainty what a DeMar LaMarcus core is capable of. And that's not much beyond the 8th seed in the Western Conference. And they're not going to get – those two guys are not on the upswing of their careers. So I think it's perfectly reasonable for Tom to question whether the bubble is an accurate representation of how the Spurs can play over an entire year. But I think it's also reasonable to say, hey, if we're the Spurs, we're better off chasing that and investigating that and going forward into that new nucleus, as opposed to trying to cling to both Aldridge and DeRozan. If that sounds fair,
it does.
That sounds fair.
Okay,
it does. No, it's just it's
what
a
else?
philosophical question, I guess.
Not going to be back, you think?
The tagline for this podcast should be to attract listeners and sponsors. Which, by the way, we're still open to sponsors.
You should tell people you should tell the people listening to this podcast where they can find this podcast.
Well, this podcast, which has the tagline "That's Fair." We have very fair takes here. Nothing too controversial, just things that kind of make sense.
Actually, I think that was our the comments, our review. Like the whole thing is just fair. Not great. It's not a great podcast. It's not terrible. It's just fair.
It's fair. So to get more from That's Fair and Spurs Insider, you can subscribe to the Spurs Nation newsletter. It's a great newsletter. You get everything from Tom and Jeff and Nick and myself. And it's on expressnews.com, and it's just a great deal that's very fair. Where were you when I interrupted? Where were you headed there, Jeff?
We were talking about free agency and stuff. We think Brent Forbes is not back or back?
I don't see really any spot for him.
Yeah,
I mean, again. A developmental triumph for this team from where he came from.
But what's the point?
But over the years, I mean, other developmental triumphs include Jonathan Simmons,
Gary Neal,
on down the line. And the Spurs have kind of historically known when to move on from those guys. All likable guys, helped a great deal. But I mean, at this point, there's just not I don't see how he fits into what they're doing. And the same for you mentioned Marco Bellinelli earlier. He's probably gone. Brent Forbes is probably gone. And those spots kind of are naturally filled by the two guys that they drafted last night, right? If Trey Jones stays around, he's probably that. He probably gets any minutes that Brent Forbes would have gotten, if he would have gotten any at all. So, yeah, I think those are.
They have a remarkably full roster already if they want it. You know, going even before they signed any outside free agents, they could start the season like this if they wanted. I wonder about guys like Chimezie Metu and Quindari Weatherspoon. Like, are those guys part of? Like, if you need a spot, it seems like those are the guys that are going to go.
Right. Yeah. And it's what we talked about last year.
You know, if you need a spot to sign Anthony Davis or something like that. Right.
But heading into last year, we talked about how depth is kind of a strength of this team, and it continues to be. You know, if somebody goes down, there's other guys that can step into those spots pretty much up and down the roster. It's just kind of the state of the NBA, the way the NBA has always been, that sure, depth is great, quality depth is great, but
stars are better.
The teams that win are the ones with stars. So I don't think that changes heading into this year. One thing that Brian Wright mentioned, another thing that Brian Wright mentioned last night when asked about the philosophy for putting a team together, he talked about just adding good players on top of good players. And,
Yeah.
they over the past few drafts, it seems like there haven't been many misses. I mean, Keldon Johnson, I think, is going to wind up being a great pick. Lonnie Walker, I think, is going to wind up being a great pick. All the way back through Derek White, DeJounte Murray. It's just a team with lots of those guys, I think, has a bit of a ceiling to bring back that term. And you need to find one that turns into Kawhi Leonard.
Yeah, all of those guys were great picks for where they were drafted in the late teens or the 20s. Now you need a guy that's a great pick for a lottery pick.
Right. And maybe they found him.
Maybe they did.
So, Tom, any final thoughts on last night or what lies ahead?
Yeah, just to repeat what I said earlier, I think they did a great job last night. With the decisions that they made, and I'd give them an A in this draft. I thought it was a good job.
Good grader. Nick Talbot.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Tom there. I think they did a good job for how the draft kind of played into their hands there on the guys they wanted to get. I think the one thing we haven't really talked about is where the other teams kind of fit in around them. And if you're talking about Spurs in the playoffs, which is always the argument, did they significantly get better than the other teams that are around them, like Minnesota, Phoenix, and the like? I think the Spurs got better, but I think everyone else kind of in that 8-10 mix also got better. I didn't like the Suns pick at all, but obviously the Suns have gotten better over the last few days with Chris Paul. So that's a big thing to look at. We haven't mentioned Klay Thompson once on this podcast, which really could impact the NBA going forward and what teams do and where they feel, what everyone kind of feels like in the pecking order. So that's kind of my last thought. Is I don't think it really changed. The draft really changed anything with where they are in the NBA as far as like making the playoffs. But I think they did a really good job and with the guys they picked.
I didn't hear a word of Tom's final thoughts, but I think it's all bunk.
The point about draft evaluations, draft podcasts, Nick says that nothing changed last night, but I can guarantee you something absolutely did change last night. We just don't know what it is yet. Whoever in that group got the best guy made itself a lot better, and it might not be the guy that the draft analysts, the people who've been evaluating these prospects for months and years think it was, but something changed last night. And we will just have to see whether it is for the better for the team that took the 3-and-D guy from Florida State, or whether it was somebody else. We'll just have to see. We will have time to get into all of that over the course of the season coming up. We have free agency where we could see some more trade action than the Spurs have seen in years. Maybe it'll be boring. Maybe it won't. We'll see. The whole thing is just that we're being fair here, and that's the point. And we will continue to be fair, have fair takes, be fair to middling, all that type of stuff as the Spurs Insider Podcast returns in the weeks to come. Until then, everybody take care of each other and keep it real.